Okay, so good evening. It's lovely again to, I suppose I'm the host of another Yad Vashem book club discussion. And tonight, so I'm Michael Pollock. So I think my qualification is that I've done this a few times. And we're looking at this particular volume tonight. We're looking at The School That Escaped the Nazis by Deborah Cadbury. Now, sometimes I approach so-called Holocaust or Shoah literature with a little bit of trepidation. And really, I expect the books to be, have to work hard to justify their inclusion in our program. And there's a sort of book, which I thought this was, my goodness, this is going to be one of them, which is a book of uplifting tales of how the human spirit can defy the odds. I always feel that that's, and the front page does have such a similar quote from A.N. Wilson. I thought, goodness, we're back in the human spirit and uplifting. The bottom line, unfortunately, is there were 6 million spirits that didn't manage to be uplifted and didn't get a chance to defy the odds. So we have had books which I think are a little bit cheesy, romanticized of the Holocaust. And I'm pleased to say that despite A.N. Wilson's, it's an uplifting reminder of how courage, etc. This is actually a much more interesting book than his comments suggest. And the title looked a little bit off-putting as well. You know, there's a formula now for Holocaust books. It's the formula of the title tends to go, the story of X who survived Y. Y is normally the word Nazi, Auschwitz, or Hitler. And X is variously a tattoo artist, a violinist, a barber, a baker. And the tale is not quite as interesting as the author originally thought it was. This time it's not a tattoo artist, a violinist, a barber, or a baker. It's actually a school. And I think that there's two stories going on here. There's the remarkable story of a school set up by refugees from initially Nazi anti-Semitism and eventually refugees from the Holocaust. So it's actually, and it's played out against the background of the Holocaust, but it's not a Holocaust book. It's actually a non-Holocaust book because it's about what these people managed to achieve despite the awful circumstances of them having to leave initially Germany, and then as the destruction spread, people were leaving Poland and coming to the UK to join this absolutely remarkable school. But I hope you'll agree with me that the school transpires to be so remarkable that it actually carries the story itself. And the tidbits of information we're getting about what's going on in Germany through 33 to 39, and then what's going on in Europe from 39 to 45, they illuminate our understanding of the people who are involved in the school story. But it is, first and foremost, I think, a wonderful story about a magnificent school. And I have to declare an interest. I am a sixth form teacher at one of our great Jewish schools at JFS. And JFS is a school for 2,000 plus students. And the downside of its magnificence in size and achievement that we can be very proud of is that occasionally individuals get lost and fall through the netting, and we're not able to help individual students perhaps as much as we would like. So this is a striking story about a completely different idea of a school. The school it's surprisingly, so it's a very progressive school, and it's set up in the beginning of the 1930s. We'll discuss the individuals involved, but one of the things, it's part of a movement of progressive education. It's not a standalone school at all. It's very much connected with other schools initially in Germany. The founder of the school, the hero of the whole story, is a lady called Anna Essingen, and she's called Tante Anna. She's Auntie Anna to all the people related to the school, but she's fully in contact with other members of the progressive school movement, and in particular, A.S. Neil, the Scottish educator. She's met him, she writes to him. He's got his school, Summerhill, which still exists, was set up 100 years ago in the 1920s. And along the lines of, I think the quote is that the Summerhill children enable children to grow up in a free range environment. So we're giving the children as much freedom as we possibly can. And this is also reflected in our school. I should say that our school that we're going to look at is in Kent, and it's initially it's in a place called Bunce Court, and that's what we're going to refer to it as. But it's very much part of this amazing movement. And although the school we're going to look at closed in 1948, it's interesting to see how Summerhill, which was its sort of close sibling, fared in the modern period of Ofsted and school tables and everything being expressed in a number, and the school's success being expressible in an overall number of maybe of UCAS points or progress ratios. And in 1999, the then Minister, Secretary of State for Education, David Blunkett, in his wisdom, issued a demand for Summerhill to start having mandatory lessons. All the lessons in Summerhill were voluntary. And there's very much similar atmosphere going on in Bunce Court. And Blunkett hit Summerhill with this mandatory lessons immediately. And the typical tabloid headline about Summerhill was "School for Scandal," referring back to the famous 1950s movie. And they survived the attack. They didn't change their policy. They took the government to court, and court ruled that the school should carry on as it is because it was doing so well working with the individual students. Summerhill typically had 60 to 80 students, and the courts also ruled that future inspection of Summerhill had to be done by inspectors who were at least qualified to look at the amazing work that Summerhill was doing with young people. And there's a quote that A.S. Neil, the founder, the very eccentric but visionary founder of Summerhill, he said the following: "I would rather Summerhill produce a happy street cleaner than a neurotic prime minister." And I think that's not how our schools, my first ever teaching job was at a school called Eton, where one of the students was one Boris Johnson, and we had another chap called David Cameron wandering around the place. And it was a hothouse to produce government ministers and ultimately prime ministers. And it wasn't a normal life. We shouldn't be surprised that our leaders are not always utterly well balanced in their decision making, because we have to look at the how they were nurtured in schools such as Eton. But Eton's not unusual. The pressure we put on kids at JFS is also sometimes unacceptably intense, but it's what the parents want. The parents want their children to achieve. So this idea of I'd rather produce a happy street cleaner than a neurotic prime minister is something that all schools should consider. You know, is the neurosis that we're imposing on our children at all fair? And a graduate of Summerhill reflected on the characteristic of the school was the absence of fear of failure, the absence of fear of authority, the absence of fear of social ostracism. And again, I think that that's something that our schools today could consider in the way they run things and the way we deal with individual students. So back to our school is Bunce Court, and is one of the movement of progressive schools. There was actually an organization which bound them together. There were regular conferences, and our hero is Anna Essingen. Now, Anna Essingen had a school in Germany, and in the days leading up to Kristallnacht and before, her family realized that things weren't going well and they needed to get out. And not only did they need to get out, but there was going to be sufficient numbers of German Jewish refugees to be able to set up a comparable school to the school that she was running in Germany already, in Kent. And they found an appropriate property, this place, Bunce Court, and they set up this amazing German Jewish, very secular. You'll see that there's not too much of a hint of Jewish religion, but very secular, but very proud Jews coming together to make this very astonishing school. And against all this, as we go through the story of the school, we always get this backdrop of what's going on in Germany and what's going on in Europe. And that very much affects the school, because initially kids who are coming are refugees from the early anti-Semitism. But as we move through the 30s, we start seeing more and more traumatized young people. And it's just so commendable how effective the school was in being able to deal with those children coming from awful circumstances, but coming into such a caring environment that you feel emotionally so happy that such a school existed for those young people. So I'd like to get some bits of the book read. So if I could initially ask Carol, would you be able to read, it's on page 87. And it's the middle paragraph. And here's an example of how independent the children were, but they weren't independent in a selfish way. They were incredibly, they responded to the caring attitude of the staff with a very responsible and caring attitude themselves. So, Carol, let me just remind you, you're muted, so perfect.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find it because I've actually got it on Kindle, so I'm just trying to. What's the what does the paragraph start with?
Page 87, and it starts, the children decided to do.
Okay. Go to, I don't know whether it works the same way on a Kindle. I'm putting in page 87. Oops. 87 page. I don't think I can find it. Sorry.
Okay. If it was something.
Oh, I found it. Got it. Sorry.
Brilliant, brilliant,
yeah.
brilliant.
Okay. So the children decided to do even more for those who cared for them and voted to test self-government for a day. They would run the school while all the teachers took a complete break away. except for a nurse in the isolation hut. The pupils created their own constitution for Brunt's Court, modelled on the Weimar Republic, crossed with the House of Commons, recalled one boy, Peter Stoll. Having seen what their country looked like without democracy, they were keen to give everyone a voice and a vote. Motions were moved and debated with considerable eloquence. However, for some mysterious reason, they were always defeated, continued Stoll. Nonetheless, the boys and girls planned their day in charge down to the last detail. Who would teach, who would supervise the practical tasks, even who would arbitrate possible quarrels, observed Hannah. When we returned, the children were elated, but obviously exhausted as they sat down with us, bubbling over with stories of their day, she wrote. Democracy was hard work. Want me to keep going?
No, that's perfect. So it gives you a sense in the 1930s, hugely progressive school, and the children actually took over the school for a day to first of all alleviate the pressure from their teachers, but to see what they could do. Now, this was an easier task in the beginning of the 30s, but we'll see that as the 1930s roll on, the school has got a new challenge, not just caring for regular students, mind you, they all were refugees of a kind. So this time, could I ask Marlene, would you read from page 157?
Getting quite apart.
No, sorry, it's the bottom paragraph, Tante Anna.
Okay.
And if you just read that paragraph, it'll take you over onto 158.
Okay. Tante Anna believed that the children were very adaptable, but many of the new arrivals had first-hand experience of extremely traumatic incidents, intensified their anxiety. There was a wide range of emotional problems. 14-year-old Ruth Borenow was one of several girls who refused to cooperate when they arrived at Bunce Court. For Ruth, the terrors of Kristallnacht in Breslau were still raw and fresh. The shock of seeing her hometown burning and her mental anguish over the disappearance of her father combined with indefinable fears. Ruth knew of a distant relative who had taken his own life. He'd had enough. He was frightened of everything. Ruth's father had eventually been released from Buchenwald concentration camp on condition that he signed over his assets to the Nazis and take his family out of the country.
So this Ruth arrives and she just doesn't want to have anything to do with any kind of authority, and she just doesn't join in any events at the school. And then Marlene, if you could go on to page 160, and that paragraph, Tante Anna, shows how well the school manages to deal with very challenging students.
Tante Anna was very sympathetic but firm. She pointed out that Ruth was one of the lucky ones who still had parents. In order not to add to the distress of the others, she wanted Ruth to ask permission before she visited her mother. Tante Anna very seldom said yes. At first, her strict rule was hard to accept, but Tante Anna recognized the acute stress for children whose parents were still trapped in the Third Reich. As Ruth reluctantly cleaned the windows, she pondered on the problems faced by other children and Tante Anna's work. Each day, the other pupils came back from task, apparently united by a bond of camaraderie. Ruth began to feel excluded and decided to join in. I soon found out that I was wrong. I picked up that you've got to know something, she said. You can't just mess about. I was being stupid. If you didn't want to learn anything, you will go for the rest of your life like that.
Thank you, thank you. I think it's if only we had the time, or someone, we don't need all the teachers to have the time, but if someone really had the time to be able to think through what's best for a student in the way that Tante Anna was able to think through what was best for this Ruth, then I think it would be wonderful in our schools, and something, you know, I'm sure you read the newspapers, and within our own families, the generation of young people growing up now are more troubled than our generation, if I can accuse you all of being anywhere near my age. But we aren't allocating sufficient time or money to being able to help those troubled children, and that the nature of their troubles runs from sort of typical psychological worries, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, but it runs through to even less significant things like huge lack of confidence and fear of coming into the class and being seen to be not as clever and brilliant as all the others. And here they managed successfully to deal with the most difficult people. We saw what Ruth had seen back home. She'd seen death. She'd seen her father had come from Buchenwald concentration camp, but there's nothing that some love and some patience won't cure. Maybe I'm being madly romantic, but I just wish we were able in our schools to be able to have at least someone who has the time to deal with, and of course we do, all schools have pastoral staff, but the pastoral staff are absolutely swamped. And whilst they may start the year very optimistic that they're going to be able to manage their workload, the reality that we have is that there isn't enough money for sufficient pastoral staff to be able to really get to grips with it. They are heroic. In our school, our pastoral staff are absolutely heroic, but it's not enough. It's not enough. We need either the Jewish community or the government. We need to find money to be able to employ people like Tante Anna, to be able to, she's made a life for a girl. This is a girl who just didn't want to have anything to do with anyone, and her love and patience gives that girl a life and gives that girl a future. So, and as I said, all the way through, you get tidbits of information that Anna was getting from her friends and her family, what's going on in Germany and how things are getting progressively worse. And they're picking up on that from the actual students who are arriving, who are increasingly traumatized or increasingly challenging. And it's a sort of, you get the story of what's going on in Bunce Court, which is really inspiring and cheery. And it's as if someone says, meanwhile, and then meanwhile takes you back to what's going on in the Shoah. And I think that the Shoah stories become so much more acute because we're seeing them in comparison to the fortunate children who managed to get out and be in Bunce Court and start having a life developed, which they will become a part of society. And part of the Bunce Court philosophy is we're bringing up children who are going to be very much part of the society. For example, two of the notable graduates of the school, one was Frank Auerbach, the very important artist, and the other one was Gerard Hoffnung, I'm scared to call him a sort of entertainer or comedian because he was so much more than that. But he was an incredibly witty but subtle and exceedingly well-educated commentator on, and I'm sure many of your homes would have a Gerard Hoffnung little corner of his best. Gerard Hoffnung at the Albert Hall, Gerard Hoffnung at the Festival Hall. He was a wonderfully funny, but very truthful commentator on our society. And it's an amazing thing that, you get a disc, a record, and you think, well, I've heard all the jokes, so I'm not going to laugh again. But in the Gerard Hoffman case, you actually play it again and you laugh again and laugh again. And I remember our family gathered round our new gramophone, our Dansette gramophone player, listening to Gerard Hoffman and laughing at the jokes that we'd already heard 10 times, but still laughing. So Gerard Hoffman, I think, is a very good expression of the graduates. Now, this balance between what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the school is beautifully illustrated by a story of they planned a cinema trip. We've got through to 1945, and the school has literally physically saved and psychologically saved child after child. And Tante Anna organizes, the school had moved to Shropshire for a while or extended into Shropshire, and she organizes a trip to the cinema. And I can't remember who, Audrey, were you happy to do some reading?
I can read.
Ah, Ruth, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So this is the story of the cinema trip, which has so much within it. That's page 312. And it's the bottom paragraph, the shocking newsreels. So the issue is that by now, newsreels, particularly of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, were becoming available, and they were being shown in the cinemas as Pathé News before the actual main cinema, the main film. So if you could start from the shocking newsreels and take it to the end of that paragraph.
The shocking newsreels of the concentration camps are playing in cinemas across the country. Towards the end of the war, Tante Anna had made a block booking for many of her pupils to go to see Laurence Olivier's Henry V at the local cinema in Wem. The film was said to be a real morale booster, as well as relevant to the school exams. Out of the blue, she received a call from the local cinema manager, advising her to cancel the school's reservation. The cinema was also showing the Pathé newsreel of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. It took a moment for her to grasp the cinema manager's concern was not for her children. The Pathé footage was stirring local opinion, he explained, and there could be trouble if there were Germans in the audience. Tante Anna told me the locals could have attacked us. Harold Jackson learned years later, such was the anger. There were still those who made little distinction between the Nazis and Jewish refugees.
So there's a wonderful, thank you, there's a wonderful double edge to the story, because we think, but how can we let these young people see the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the appalling state that the survivors are in, because that's their families. That's the story of what would have happened to many of their families. So, and they're going off to see Henry V with Laurence Olivier, this wonderful jingoistic expression of British pride, once more into the breach and St. Crispin's Day, and those great speeches of military gung-ho and let's up and at them. And you can imagine that the film at the time was hugely popular because of its content of this great military figure, Henry V, being portrayed by the greatest Shakespearean actor of his time. And the concern you would have thought would be for the children. How can they watch the Bergen-Belsen liberation? But that's not the folk of Wem didn't distinguish between one kind of German and another type of German, and they would have been so stirred up by the terrible images from Bergen-Belsen that even young Jewish Germans would have been at risk. So the cinema manager suggested that they don't come. The school lasted all the way till 1948. Unlike, as I said, Summerhill, Summerhill has had its bumpy ups and downs, but it's still up. It's still there, providing an education for the kind of students who need it. This school finished in 1948. It ran out of money. There was no good reason. Well, there was good reason, but people didn't feel that it was an urgent cause anymore. There were no more refugees coming. And although we can identify refugees from life, and they need a school like this, but the drama of the refugees from Nazi Germany was finished, and therefore the school closed. Tante Anna herself passed away in 1960. And it's a wonderful, if I say heartwarming, that really sounds terribly cliched, but it's a wonderful story about what teachers and schools can really do for young people if they're given the time and I suppose a little bit of money, and are asked to really make sure that no young person goes through school and has to unnecessarily suffer well-being issues. And I think it should be compulsory reading for every Ofsted inspector, and compulsory reading for every headmaster. I found it really, really, really moving. And a lot of the Holocaust, when the book goes into its meanwhile back in Germany, there was, because it was very focused on Tante Anna's family and the students' families, there was a lot of very rich local insights into what was really going on and the nature of the anti-Semitism. I found it fantastic on the anti-Semitism of the 30s and how ordinary Germans embraced Nazism and elevated Hitler, even in 1933, to an almost divine status. A lot of really good Holocaust material, but the real story is a story about what schools can do for children and should be a challenge to all of us. See whether we can bring this kind of thinking into our educational systems. I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to ask, from those people who have read it, what did you come away with when you read this book, and did you feel as positive towards it as I did? Okay, so let me ask the big question. Have people had a chance to read the book? Clearly, Audrey, you probably have, because it was on your Kindle.
I've read it.
Ruth,
Yeah.
So did you feel as positive as me towards it?
I did, and I feel it's a shame that education is not doesn't go that way. But also for me, I had never read anything where it's a lot of it, the Holocaust is shown from the children's perspective.
Yes.
Because everything is usually written by adults. So I thought that was very unusual, maybe not unusual, but a very interesting way to.
Yes, I think it was very effective, because you're getting the facts through the prism of the children's reactions, and that was very powerful. And when you do that, you don't have to say use lots of adjectives about how awesome and awful and terrible the events were. You can just imagine the children's face as they're hearing about their friends and family in Germany. I think, and you see how it impacts on their behavior and the challenge that makes the school. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think there was a very effective way of telling a large part of the Holocaust story. So yeah, I think it would be a very effective book for young people to read as well, although they'd rumble how limited our schools are. Did anyone else pick up on the contrast between this kind of progressive school and our schools are terrific? I don't want anyone to think that I'm moaning about schools. I'm not biting the hand that feeds me. But we are missing a big opportunity, which books like this highlight what we could be doing. I sort of read it And the following morning, I'm, you know, I've got the Bunce Court mood in me. I'm really going to help young people today. And of course, that lasts from about 8:30 to 8:40, when the rigors of A-level and GCSE teaching impose themselves, and you never get to recreating Bunce Court. Did anyone else get a chance to read it? Yes, Carol.
I mean, I think, you know, I think probably for its time, it was very forward thinking, wasn't it? As you say, it's a progressive school.
Yeah.
I can't imagine, you know, many schools, you know, if you think about schools back in that era in this country, they wouldn't have been running, they would be quite structured, wouldn't they, and quite formal, whereas this felt a lot more informal and nurturing, really. And yes, sadly, we don't these days have the capacity to do as much as, you know, they're doing for their children there.
Yeah, but we could have the capacity if we, you know, if we said the most important thing in the world is not getting 3 A stars. The most important thing in the world is being happy and rounded and free of well-being issues. And that's where every teacher was looking. Every teacher was trying to make their classroom a warm place. I had an Ofsted inspection, and the Ofsted inspector had a couple of reservations, which included, and I quote, that my classroom was very warm. And I thought that was great. You know, my classroom's very warm, it's nice, kids are comfortable there. But apparently for the Ofsted inspector, I came out with a decent comment overall, but he thought the kids were too relaxed and too at home in the class. They're not putting their feet up on their desks. It's nothing as chaotic as that, but just that they should feel unthreatened during the course of a lesson. He said unchallenged. I'm not sure that that's the worst thing ever. So thank you very much, Carol. There was a lovely comment on the chat, so thank you for that lovely comment. Anyone else managed to have a look at the book, or has a thought about the book?
Yeah, I've almost finished it, but I was thinking that it would be a good book to be included in the curriculum for Holocaust education.
Yeah,
because young people would really relate to it.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I was thinking that whilst one of the other contributors was talking about how the Holocaust is told through children's eyes, but in a very subtle and effective way. But the problem is that we'd have to take on the threatening nature of the success of the school in helping young people through being patient and giving them time. So I'm not sure that our schools would quite like to, we'd all love to advocate it, but we don't have the money to be able to advocate that kind of caring pastoral relationship. And let me say, I believe we at JFS have 5 full-time pastoral officers, and they are heroic in the efforts they put in and the evening conversations with parents, etc. However, it's not enough, and I don't think, and that, you know, and we are quite caring relative to other schools, and what's going on across the education system when contrasted to this wonderful school, I think is really depressing. So,
I think though with this school though, it's the head that has inspired everybody. So you need to have one person maybe leading that inspires. I'm not saying anything against pastoral care, but it's just the whole energy in the school inspires everybody. I mean, it's the head really, I think, that has on this.
Yes,
She's brought the right people together.
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there is this Tanta Anna. I mean, she's Tanta Anna, isn't she? She's not the head. She's Auntie Anna. And if you can't contrast Auntie Anna with the titles that school use now, pastoral officers. Pastoral officer. If you were in the need of chatting to someone, would you go to someone whose title was an officer? I think it's probably not. So that betrays how the system controls even our attempts to fix things for young people. But I think that's a really important point about the head. She's not the head, she's Auntie Anna. And as Auntie Anna, she's able to achieve amazing things. So yes, thank you. That's a really important point. So if you haven't read it, let me ask a different question. Have we convinced you to go out and get it and read it immediately? So Robert, you're there with your camera on, and it's a really stupid question. Is that a drum kit in the background?
It is.
Wow.
And, it was my son. Two of my sons have played drum kit, and now it's my grandchildren who enjoy playing it. So that's why I've got it. I've still got it in my room, my study. Yes, I'm certainly convinced that this is a book well worth reading. I'm particularly interested because my background is in primary education, and I worked for many years in initial teacher education, teacher training, in other words. So I'm particularly interested in the philosophy of the school, as indeed you obviously are. And I'm very interested in many of the observations that you've made about education today. I think that there are some very encouraging things that one can say about education today, and particularly in the early years. And while I accept that there are many aspects of contemporary education which worry me a great deal and worry many other colleagues in initial teacher education, there are some very positive signs as well. And I think particularly in the early years in nursery education, some of the principles that the teachers are committed to are very close to the principles of the school that you've been describing, where there is a concern that it's the children that provide the key agenda for their own education. And there is great encouragement for children to take ownership of what they're learning. In other words, there's a strong commitment to child-centeredness in education. Now, but I think as you advance through the years, that kind of philosophy evaporates for a variety of reasons, and particularly possibly in secondary education. And so while I recognize that there is much in contemporary education, contemporary schools, that leaves a great deal to be desired in terms of the pressure of examinations, high stakes accountability, particularly in the primary school as well as in the secondary school. I recognize that, but I think there are some teachers and schools that are still trying to do their best, as you've pointed out, despite all of those pressures. And therefore, when I go into a school as a school governor, and I've been a school governor for 30 years or so, more often than not, I am inspired by what I see. But I'm inspired by what I see, not because of the legislation from the government, but rather because of the way in which teachers are coping with the job of teaching, despite the kind of pressures that they're having to work to. So I remain so optimistic about the future, despite the despite the kind of criticisms of the contemporary systems that I share with you.
So, thank you, Robert. Let me ask, I presume most people have been parents or are grandparents. So if you had a school like Bunce Court available, where I'm afraid to say the likelihood is your children, grandchildren are going to drop a grade here or there in their GCSEs, but are going to come out very responsible and very happy, would you be comfortable that those dropped grades may preclude your children going to Oxbridge, and they're going to have to end up in UCL? They're going to be at excellent universities, but not quite the cream of the cream. Is that a trade-off that parents would be comfortable with?
Can I just say, I don't have children, but why do people have to go to university?
Uh-huh.
I don't think I think that's a pressure that everybody has to go to university. My nephew is going to be 19 this year, and he's for almost 2 years been doing an apprenticeship in something. So he left home at 17, and I feel that he has matured amazingly well, so much more than other kids I'm aware of the same age as him, because he's working and he's training on something. He's not particularly academic, but I think, you know, by the time his friends come out of university, he will be in a very different place. He would have had a different life education. He's working, he's understanding about money. He doesn't have the same kind of holidays as a lot of his friends who are still at school or university. So I don't think university is necessarily the thing to have. And also people have this expectation that they should have a job when they leave university. I would think university is much more, unless you're studying a specific vocation like a science or medicine, that you have a right to have a job when you come out. Whereas I think it should be more about an education in life. And then that should help you to find a job.
Well, so you've got a very sensible brother or sister who's the parent of your nephew. My experience of trying to persuade parents that university, not only university is not for their children, but they're not going to get into Oxford, and therefore to go through the whole process for them to fail is really unkind, and they'll be the one that fail to get in. There's no point, and there are so many wonderful alternatives. And if I say wonderful alternatives like apprenticeships, it sounds patronizing. I don't mean it to be patronizing in any way, but the pressures we put on young people to achieve. So we're March, we're going to April, the A-levels GCSEs start in May. The pressures for these young people is, I think, is unacceptably high. What's the worst? The worst is they're going to go to a lesser university, or they're going to do something very helpful in developing their lives, like an apprenticeship. How bad is that? I'm afraid to say, for many parents, that would be absolutely awful and shameful. Let me have, yes, Brian, fair enough.
It depends on what the child is like. I mean, it's not going to suit every child to go there in the same way as a normal, if you like, academic school is probably not going to suit everybody the other way around. So I think hopefully you would know your child. My daughter's sitting next to me, and she's telling me that I put her under terrible pressure. I like to treat my children slightly differently, because they had different needs, if you like, and different skill sets. And I would hope that I would have done the two together, would have looked at them that way.
Would you tell your daughter that she'll be grateful one day?
I keep telling her that, Michael. She doesn't believe me.
That moment where she says, "Thank you so much for driving me mad," is only weeks away. You have to believe it.
Okay, I'll hang on to that one.
Could I ask? There's a couple of people who haven't contributed. Either of the two Susans, Are you taken by this school as somewhere that you would admire and advocate that it's much of its message is imported into our mainstream schools? Does anyone else want to make a comment along the lines of, do we have something to learn from this school? Well, Marlene, your microphone's off. Your microphone's on, so.
Microphone's on, and all my children went to university, which really pleased me, as I didn't have that opportunity until I was in my 50s. So it did me a lot of good at that age. It really did. I don't know if it was the right thing. I certainly think one of my children would have benefited from meeting with Tante Anna and being in that environment.
Right. And I think, yes, sorry.
So I have that finished.
I think every school would benefit from having a Tante Anna department somewhere where you go. We do try and create it in our school, but it's the lack of time that makes it so difficult. That you sit down and talk to a student and try and encourage them in a particular direction, but there's 10 other students who need you to mark work. So you just never get around to completing the task of really helping students in need of help. And that's clearly something that Tante Anna managed to achieve. So, Sophie, I'm going to wind up here. Oh, sorry, Robert.
Well, I was just going to say that while I think that there appears to be a lot that one can learn from the school Barnes Court, and it is obviously the book deserves very careful scrutiny. I think probably I might have some reservations about sending my own children to the school, because I'd want to ensure that there was a balance between a respect for the children's individuality and a commitment to the quality of experience that children are entitled to and opportunities to experience as wide a curriculum as possible. I would be rather concerned if my child went to, well, I wouldn't have sent my child to Summerhill, I don't think. But my concern there is that because the child is making all the decisions for himself or herself, they can actually provide themselves with a very restricted range of experiences. There is that danger. And the child isn't necessarily sufficiently mature at the age of 12 or 13 to know what might in the long term be in their best interests in terms of the pathways they ought to be following. So I would always be looking for a school, I think, and I'm not now looking for a school, except I have interest as a grandparent, of course. I'd be looking for a school that offered a balance between respect for pupil individuality and a respect for the children's entitlement to a range of quality experiences right across the curriculum. And therefore, I would see education as being very much about the interaction between teacher and pupil. It's not one-sided. And the danger of that kind of school, and certainly the risks of a Summerhill type school, is that the education becomes very one-sided, and because the onus is very much on the child all the time to make all the decisions. And for me, that can lead to a situation of anarchy.
Well, one of the criticisms of Summerhill, when you read the graduates who came from there, they found that when they hit the real world, they were very naive. The attitude at Summerhill, where you make up your own mind and you make your own decisions, is not the world we live in. And therefore, in a sense, they were less well prepared for the cut and thrust of employment and what we call the real world. And it's I think it probably is a very valid criticism. I think I have to apologize to Sophie, Ev, and Yad Vashem for stealing your book club and talking about education and pedagogy.
We're grateful that you're here tonight.
I hope you don't mind, but I think it. Who chose this book? Is
Simon.
Simon. Okay, well, I think it was a very good choice. Although I can't imagine that Simon would be a big advocate of the Bunce Court type education, but maybe it's got through to him in an unpredictable way. So if I can say thank you very much to Yad Vashem for organizing it and for suggesting that we have a look at this book. If you haven't had a look at it, please have a look at it. It's well worth several hours of anyone's time, and reflecting on it is, I think, something which we can all do and benefit from. And can I thank everyone who's come and listened and contributed. Thank you very, very much. You've made this, for me anyhow, a very fulfilling evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.